Institutes of the Christian Religion by John Calvin, Book 1, Chapter 5. The knowledge of God shines forth in the fashioning of the universe and the continuing government of it. Numbers 1 through 10, God manifested in his created works. 1. The clarity of God's self-disclosure strips us of every excuse. The final goal of the blessed life, moreover, rests in the knowledge of God, John 17:3. Lest anyone, then, be excluded from access to happiness, he not only sowed in men's minds the seed of religion of which we have spoken, but revealed himself and daily discloses himself in the whole workmanship of the universe. As a consequence, men cannot open their eyes without being compelled to see him. Indeed, his essence is incomprehensible. Hence, his divineness far escapes all human perception. But upon his individual works, he has engraved unmistakable marks of his glory, so clear and so prominent that even unlettered and stupid folk cannot plead the excuse of ignorance. Therefore, the prophet very aptly exclaims that he is clad with light as with a garment. Psalm 104:2. It is as if he had said, "Thereafter the Lord began to show himself in the visible splendor of his apparel. Ever since, in the creation of the universe, he brought forth those insignia whereby he shows his glory to us, whenever and wherever we cast our gaze." Likewise, the same prophet skillfully compares the heavens as they are stretched out to his royal tent, and says that he has laid the beams of his chambers on the waters, has made the clouds his chariot, rides on the wings of the wind, and that the winds and lightning bolts are his swift messengers. Psalm 104:2-4. And since the glory of his power and wisdom shine more brightly above, heaven is often called his palace. Psalm 11:4. Yet, in the first place, wherever you cast your eyes, there is no spot in the universe wherein you cannot discern at least some spark of his glory. You cannot in one glance survey this most vast and beautiful system of the universe in its wide expanse without being completely overwhelmed by the boundless force of its brightness. The reason why the author of the letter of the Hebrews elegantly calls the universe the appearance of things invisible, Hebrews 11:3, is that this skillful ordering of the universe is for us a sort of mirror in which we can contemplate God, who is otherwise invisible. The reason why the prophet attributes to the heavenly creatures a language known to every nation, Psalm 19:2, is that therein lies an attestation of divinity so apparent that it ought not to escape the gaze of even the most stupid tribe. The apostle declares this more clearly. What men need to know concerning God has been disclosed to them. For one and all gaze upon his invisible nature, known from the creation of the world, even unto his eternal power and divinity. Romans 1:19 and 20. 2. The divine wisdom displayed for all to see. There are innumerable evidences both in heaven and on earth that declare his wonderful wisdom, not only those more recondite matters for the closer observation of which astronomy, medicine, and all natural science are intended, but also those which thrust themselves upon the sight of even the most untutored and ignorant persons, so that they cannot open their eyes without being compelled to witness them. Indeed, men who have either quaffed or even tasted the liberal arts penetrate with their aid far more deeply into the secrets of the divine wisdom. Yet ignorance of them prevents no one from seeing more than enough of God's workmanship in his creation to lead him to break forth in admiration of the artificer. To be sure, there is need of art and of more exacting toil in order to investigate the motion of the stars, to determine their assigned stations, to measure their intervals, to note their properties. As God's providence shows itself more explicitly when one observes these, so the mind must rise to a somewhat higher level to look upon his glory. Even the common folk and the most untutored, who have been taught only by the aid of the eyes, cannot be unaware of the excellence of divine art, for it reveals itself in this innumerable and yet distinct and well-ordered variety of the heavenly host. It is, accordingly, clear that there is no one whom the Lord does not abundantly show his wisdom. Likewise, in regard to the structure of the human body, one must have the greatest keenness in order to weigh, with Galen's skill, its articulation, symmetry, beauty, and use. But yet, as all acknowledge, the human body shows itself to be a composition so ingenious that its artificer is rightly judged a wonder-worker. 3. Man as the loftiest proof of divine wisdom. Certain philosophers, accordingly, long ago, not ineptly called man a microcosm, because he is a rare example of God's power, goodness, and wisdom, and contains within himself enough miracles to occupy our minds, if only we are not irked at paying attention to them. Paul, having stated that the blind man can find God by feeling after him, immediately adds that he ought not to be sought afar off, Acts 17:27. For each one undoubtedly feels within the heavenly grace that quickens him. Indeed, if there is no need to go outside ourselves to comprehend God, what pardon will the indolence of that man deserve who is loath to descend within himself to find God? For the same reason, David, when he has briefly praised the admirable name and glory of God, which shine everywhere, immediately exclaims, "What is man that you are mindful of him?" Psalm 8:4. Likewise, out of the mouths of babes and sucklings thou hast established strength. Psalm 8:2. Indeed, he not only declares that a clear mirror of God's works is in humankind, but that infants, while they nurse at their mother's breasts, have tongues so eloquent to preach his glory that there is no need at all of other orators. Consequently also, he does not hesitate to bring their infant speech into the debate, as if they were thoroughly instructed to refute the madness of those who might desire to extinguish God's name in favor of their own devilish pride. Consequently, too, there comes in that which Paul quotes from Aratus, that we are God's offspring, Acts 17:28, because by adorning us with such great excellence, he testifies that he is our Father. In the same way, the secular poets, out of a common feeling and, as it were, at the dictation of experience, called him the Father of men. Indeed, no one gives himself freely and willingly to God's service unless, having tasted his fatherly love, he is drawn to love and worship him in return. 4. But man turns ungratefully against God. Here, however, the foul ungratefulness of men is disclosed. They have within themselves a workshop graced with God's unnumbered works, and at the same time a storehouse overflowing with inestimable riches. They ought, then, to break forth into praise of him, but are actually puffed up, swollen with all the more pride. They feel in many wonderful ways that God works in them. They are also taught by the same use of these things what a great variety of gifts they possess from his liberality. They are compelled to know, whether they will or not, that these are the signs of divinity, yet they conceal them within. Indeed, there is no need to go outside themselves, provided they do not, by claiming for themselves what has been given them from heaven, bury in the earth that which enlightens their mind to see God clearly. Even today the earth sustains many monstrous spirits who, to destroy God's name, do not hesitate to misdirect all the seed of divinity spread abroad in human nature. How detestable, I ask you, is this madness, that man, finding God in his body and soul 100 times, on this very pretense of excellence, denies that there is a God. They will not say it is by chance that they are distinct from brute creatures. Yet they set aside God, the while using nature, which for them is the artificer of all things, as a cloak. They see such exquisite workmanship in their individual members, from mouth and eyes even to their very toenails. Here also they substitute nature for God. But such agile motions of the soul, such excellent faculties, such rare gifts, especially bear upon the face of them a divinity that does not allow itself readily to be hidden, unless the Epicureans, like the Cyclops, should from this height all the more shamelessly wage war against God. Do all the creatures of heavenly wisdom concur in rolling a 5-foot worm, while the whole universe lacks this privilege? First, to establish that there is something organic in the soul that should correspond to its several parts in no way obscures God's glory, but rather illumines it. Let Epicurus answer what concourse of atoms cooks food and drink, turns part of it into excrement, part into blood, and begets such industry in the several members to carry out their tasks, as if so many souls ruled one body by common counsel. 5. The confusion of creature with creator. But now I have no concern with that pigsty. Rather, I take to task those given to fanciful subtleties, who willingly drag forth in oblique fashion that frigid statement of Aristotle, both to destroy the immortality of the soul and to deprive God of his right. For, since the soul has organic faculties, they by this pretext bind the soul to the body, so that it may not subsist without it. And by praising nature, they suppress God's name as far as they can. Yet the powers of the soul are far from being confined to functions that serve the body. Of what concern is it to the body that you measure the heavens, gather the number of the stars, determine the magnitude of each, know what space lies between them, with what swiftness or slowness they complete their courses, how many degrees this way or that way they decline? I confess, indeed, that astronomy has some use, but I am only showing that in this deepest investigation of heavenly things there is no organic symmetry, but here is an activity of the soul distinct from the body. I have put forth one example, from which it will be easy for my readers to derive the rest. Manifold indeed is the nimbleness of the soul, with which it surveys heaven and earth, joins past to future, retains in memory something heard long before, nay, pictures to itself whatever it pleases. Manifold also is the skill with which it devises incredible things, and which is the mother of so many marvelous devices. These are unfailing signs of divinity in man. Why is it that the soul not only vaguely roves about but conceives many useful things, ponders concerning many, even divines the future, all while man sleeps? What ought we say here except that the signs of immortality which have been implanted in man cannot be effaced? Now what reason would there be to believe that man is divine and not to recognize his Creator? Shall we indeed distinguish between right and wrong by that judgment which has been implanted to us, yet will there be no judge in heaven? Will there remain for us even in sleep some remnant of intelligence, yet will no God keep watch and governance of the world? Shall we think ourselves the inventors of so many arts and useful things that God may be defrauded of his praise, even though experience sufficiently teaches that what we have has been unequally distributed among us from another source? Some persons, moreover, babble about secret inspiration that gives life to the whole universe. But what they say is not only weak, but completely profane. Virgil's famous saying pleases them. Quote, "First of all, an inner spirit feeds, sky, earth, and watery fields, the shining orb, of moon and Titan star, and mind pervades. Its members sways, all the masses unites. With its great frame, thence come the race of man and beast, the life of winged things, strange shapes. The ocean bears beneath his glassy floor, of fire the vigor, and divine the source of those life seeds." End quote. as if the universe, which was founded as a spectacle of God's glory, were its own creator. For thus the same author has elsewhere followed the view common to the Greeks and Latins alike. Quote, "The bees, some teach, received a share of mind, divine ethereal drought. For God, men say, pervades all things, the earth, expanse of seas, and heaven's depth. From him the flocks and herds, men and beasts of every sort, at birth, draw slender life. Yea, unto him all things do then return, unmade are then restored. Death has no place, but still alive they fly, unto the starry ranks, to heaven's height." End quote. See, of what value to beget and nourish godliness in men's hearts is that jejune speculation about the universal mind which animates and quickens the world. This shows itself even more clearly in the sacrilegious words of the filthy dog Lucretius, which have been deduced from that principle. This is indeed making a shadow deity to drive away the true God, whom we should fear and adore. I confess, of course, that it can be said reverently, provided that it proceeds from a reverent mind, that nature is God. But because it is a harsh and improper saying, since nature is rather the order prescribed by God, it is harmful in such weighty matters, in which special devotion is due, to involve God confusedly in the inferior course of his works. 6. The Creator reveals his lordship over the creation. Let us therefore remember, whenever each of us contemplates his own nature, that there is one God who so governs all natures that he would have us look unto him, direct our faith to him, and worship and call upon him. For nothing is more preposterous than to enjoy the very remarkable gifts that attest the divine nature within us, yet to overlook the author who gives them to us at our asking. With what clear manifestations his might draws us to contemplate him! Unless perchance it be unknown to us in whose power it lies to sustain this infinite mass of heaven and earth by his word. By his nod alone sometimes to shake heaven with thunderbolts, to burn everything with lightnings, to kindle the air with flashes, sometimes to disturb it with various sorts of storms, and then at his pleasure to clear them away in a moment, to compel the sea, which by its height seems to threaten the earth with continual destruction, to hang as if it were in mid-air, sometimes to arouse it in a dreadful way with the tumultuous force of winds, sometimes with waves quieted, to make it calm again. Belonging to this theme are the praises of God's power from the testimonies of nature, which one meets here and there, especially indeed in the book of Job and in Isaiah. These I now intentionally pass over, for they will find more appropriate place where I shall discuss from the Scriptures the creation of the universe. Now I have only wanted to touch upon the fact that this way of seeking God is common both to strangers and to those of his household, if they trace the outlines that above and below sketch a living likeness of him. This very might leads us to ponder his eternity. For he from whom all things draw their origin must be eternal and have beginning from himself. Furthermore, if the cause is sought by which he was led to create all these things, and is now moved to preserve them, we shall find that it is his goodness alone. But this being the sole cause, it ought still to be more than sufficient to draw us to his love, inasmuch as there is no creature, as the prophet declares, upon whom God's mercy has not been poured out. Psalm 145, verse 9. 7. God's government and judgment. In the second kind of works, which are outside the ordinary course of nature also, proofs of his powers just as clear are set forth. For in administering human society, he so tempers his providence that, although kindly and beneficent toward all in numberless ways, he still, by open and daily indications, declares his clemency to the godly and his severity to the wicked and criminal. For there are no doubts about what sort of vengeance he takes on wicked deeds. Thus he clearly shows himself the protector and vindicator of innocence, while he prospers the life of good men with his blessings, relieves their need, soothes and mitigates their pain, and alleviates their calamities. And in all these things he provides for their salvation. And indeed, the unfailing rule of his righteousness ought not to be obscured by the fact that he frequently allows the wicked and malefactors to exult unpunished for some time, while he permits the upright and deserving to be tossed about by many adversities, and even to be oppressed by the malice and iniquity of the impious. But a far different consideration ought rather to enter our minds, that when with a manifest show of his anger he punishes one sin, he hates all sins, that when he leaves many sins unpunished, there will be another judgment to which have been deferred the sins yet to be punished. Similarly, what great occasion he gives us to contemplate his mercy, when he often pursues miserable sinners with unwearied kindness, until he shatters their wickedness by imparting benefits, and by recalling them to him with more than fatherly kindness. 8. God's sovereign sway over the life of men. To this end, the prophet is mindful that in their desperate straits, God suddenly and wonderfully, and beyond all hope, succors the poor and almost lost. Those wandering through the desert he protects from wild beasts, and at last guides them back to the way. Psalm 107, verses 4-7. To the needy and hungry he supplies food. The prisoners he frees from loathsome dungeons and iron bands. The shipwrecked he leads back to port unharmed. The half-dead he cures of disease. He burns the earth with heat and dryness, or makes it fertile with secret watering of grace. He raises up the humblest from the crowd, or casts down the lofty from the high level of their dignity. By setting forth examples of this sort, the prophet shows that what are thought to be chance occurrences are just so many proofs of heavenly providence, especially of fatherly kindness, and hence ground for rejoicing is given to the godly, while as for the wicked and the reprobate, their mouths are stopped. But because most people, immersed in their own errors, are struck blind in such dazzling theater, he exclaims that to weigh these works of God wisely is a matter of rare and singular wisdom, in viewing which they who otherwise seem to be extremely acute profit nothing. And certainly, however much the glory of God shines forth, scarcely 1 man in 100 is a true spectator of it. In no greater degree is his power or his wisdom hidden in darkness. His power shows itself clearly when the ferocity of the impious, and everyone's opinion unconquerable, is overcome in a moment, their arrogance vanquished, their strongest defenses destroyed, their javelins and armor shattered, their strength broken, their machinations overturned, and themselves fallen of their own weight. And when their audacity, which exalted them above heaven, lays them low even to the center of the earth. When, conversely, the humble are raised up from the dust, and the needy are lifted up from the dung heap. Psalm 113:7. The oppressed and afflicted are rescued from their extreme tribulation, the despairing are restored to good hope, the unarmed, few and weak, snatch victory from the armed, many and strong. Indeed, his wisdom manifests its excellence when he dispenses everything at the best opportunity, when he confounds all wisdom of the world, 1 Corinthians 1:20, when he catches the crafty in their own craftiness, 1 Corinthians 3:19. In short, there is nothing that he does not temper in the best way. 9. We ought not to rack our brains about God, but rather we should contemplate him in his works. We see that no long or toilsome proof is needed to elicit evidences that serve to illuminate and affirm the divine majesty. Since from the few we have sampled at random, whithersoever you turn, it is clear that they are so very manifest and obvious that they can easily be observed with the eyes and pointed out with the finger. And here again we ought to observe that we are called to a knowledge of God, not that knowledge which content and empty speculation merely flits in the brain, but that which will be sound and fruitful if we duly perceive it, and if it takes root in the heart. For the Lord manifests himself by his powers, the force of which we feel within ourselves and the benefits of which we enjoy. We must therefore be much more profoundly affected by this knowledge than if we were to imagine a God of whom no perception came through to us. Consequently, we know the most perfect way of seeking God and the most suitable order is not for us to attempt with bold curiosity to penetrate to the investigation of his essence, which we ought more to adore than meticulously to search out, but for us to contemplate him in his works, whereby he renders himself near and familiar to us, and in some manner communicates himself. The Apostle was referring to this when he said that we need not seek him far away, seeing that he dwells by his very present power in each of us, Acts 17, verses 27 to 28. For this reason, David, having first confessed his unspeakable greatness, Psalm 145:3, afterward proceeds to mention his works and profess that he will declare his greatness, Psalm 145, verse 5 to 6. It is also fitting, therefore, for us to pursue this particular search for God, which may so hold our mental powers suspended in wonderment as at the same time to stir us deeply. And as Augustine teaches elsewhere, because disheartened by his greatness we cannot grasp him, we ought to gaze upon his works, that we may be restored by his goodness. 10. The purpose of this knowledge of God. Knowledge of this sort, then, ought not only to arouse in us a worship of God, but also to awaken and encourage us to the hope of the future life. For since we notice that the examples that the Lord shows us, both of his clemency and of his severity, are inchoate and incomplete, doubtless we must consider this to presage even greater things, the manifestation and full exhibition which are deferred to another life. On the other hand, since we see the pious laden with afflictions by the impious, stricken with unjust acts, overwhelmed with slanders, wounded with abuses and reproaches, while the wicked, on the contrary, flourish, are prosperous, obtain repose with dignity, and that without punishment, we must straightway conclude that there will be another life in which iniquity is to have its punishment, and righteousness is to be given its reward. Furthermore, since we observe that believers are often chastised by the Lord's rods, we may with full assurance believe that one day the wicked must no less suffer his lash. Indeed, Augustine's remark is well known. If now every sin were to suffer open punishment, it would seem that nothing is reserved for the final judgment. Again, if God were now to punish no sin openly, one would believe that there is no providence. We must therefore admit in God's individual works, but especially in them as a whole, that God's powers are actually represented as in a painting. Thereby the whole of mankind is invited and attracted to recognition of him, and from this to true and complete happiness. Now those powers appear most clearly in his works. Yet we comprehend their chief purpose, their value, and the reason why we should ponder them, only when we descend into ourselves and contemplate by what means the Lord shows in us his life, wisdom, and power, and exercises in our behalf his righteousness, goodness, and mercy. For even though David justly complains that unbelievers are foolish because they do not ponder the deep designs of God in the governance of mankind, Psalm 92, 5 and 6, yet what he says elsewhere is very true, that God's wonderful wisdom here abounds more than the hairs of our head, Psalm 40, verse 12. But because this argument is to be treated more amply below, I now pass over it.